My beloved child, something changed in the quietest possible way when this person stopped asking God for signs about you and finally asked for only one thing: the chance to marry you. But what makes this moment different is not the request itself. It is the reason they gave after it. A reason they had never said aloud to anyone. A reason that surprised even them when the words finally formed in their heart. They were not asking because they were lonely. They were not asking because they were afraid of losing you. And they were not imagining some perfect future where every difficulty simply disappeared. Their prayer came from a much deeper realization, one that had been growing through all the ordinary moments when they thought nothing important was happening. Don't skip, because what they finally understood about you was not obvious at first. For a long time, this person believed love was supposed to feel dramatic. They thought the right connection would arrive with certainty, perfect timing, effortless conversations, and no confusing pauses. But then you entered their emotional world in a completely different way. Somehow, your presence made them think more carefully. Your absence made them notice what mattered. Your kindness stayed in their memory longer than grand gestures from anyone else ever had. And slowly, quietly, they began realizing that what they felt around you was not excitement they needed to chase. It was peace they did not want to lose. That distinction changed everything. One evening, when the day had finally gone still, they found themselves remembering something incredibly small about you. Not some dramatic confession. Not an unforgettable scene. Just a moment when you had shown a kind of patience they did not expect. Perhaps you listened when you could have interrupted. Perhaps you stayed gentle when misunderstanding would have made coldness easier. Perhaps you respected something vulnerable without turning it into a weakness. Whatever the exact moment was, it returned to them with unusual clarity, and suddenly they understood why their thoughts had kept finding their way back to you. You had made them feel that love could be safe without becoming boring, deep without becoming heavy, meaningful without requiring constant proof. Stay till the end, because this is where their reason begins to reveal itself. They did not ask God, "Please let me marry this person because I cannot live without them." Their heart was moving in another direction entirely. It was closer to this: if I am ever given the privilege of building a life beside someone, let it be with the person who makes me want to become more honest, more patient, more grateful, and more present. And when they realized they were describing you, they became silent. Completely silent. Because suddenly marriage was no longer an idea in the distant future. It had your face attached to it. It had the sound of conversations they had replayed privately. It had the memory of moments when you probably had no idea they were watching the way you handled something difficult. It had your quiet strength woven through it. And this is where something even more personal surfaced. This person had once believed that choosing someone forever meant finding a person who could complete every missing piece inside them. But knowing you slowly challenged that belief. You did not make them feel incomplete without you. You made them want to arrive beside you as someone whole enough to love you responsibly. That realization touched them more deeply than attraction ever could. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided before. Could I protect the peace between us instead of constantly needing to be right? Could I communicate when silence feels easier? Could I stand beside this person on ordinary days, not only beautiful ones? Could I celebrate their growth without feeling threatened by it? Could I create a home where both of us remain ourselves? And something unexpected happened each time they considered those questions. Instead of feeling trapped by commitment, they felt strangely calm. Something important is waiting for you in that calmness, because it explains why their prayer became so specific. This person is not simply imagining a wedding. They are imagining mornings, responsibilities, shared decisions, quiet dinners after tiring days, laughter over things nobody else would understand. The ordinary details people rarely romanticize. And somehow, those ordinary details are exactly what made their feelings become extraordinary. They pictured you sitting across from them years from now, not as a fantasy frozen in time, but as someone who would continue changing, learning, becoming. And they realized they did not merely want the version of you they understand today. They wanted the privilege of discovering who you would become tomorrow. That thought stayed with them. It followed them into another day. Then another. Until finally they understood something they could no longer dismiss. The deepest reason they wanted to marry you was not because you made their life feel exciting. It was because your presence made a meaningful life feel possible. There is a difference. A very important one. Excitement asks, how do you make me feel right now? Mature love begins asking, what can we build with what we feel? And somewhere inside this person, that question had already begun answering itself. They remembered the times you showed strength without making a performance of it. The moments when you cared without demanding recognition. The way something about you seemed to carry both softness and boundaries at once. Maybe you never considered those qualities remarkable. Perhaps you assumed nobody noticed them. But this person did. Not always immediately. Sometimes they understood your value only after comparing the peace they felt around you with the emotional noise they had experienced elsewhere. Sometimes distance taught them what proximity could not. Sometimes one quiet memory of you revealed more than hours of conversation. And then came the moment that changed the tone of their prayer completely. They stopped asking for you as though you were something to possess. Instead, they asked for the wisdom to recognize whether they could truly become the kind of partner you deserved. That is what left them emotionally still. They realized that wanting to marry you also meant accepting responsibility for how they would love you. It meant understanding that your heart was not a prize. Your trust was not automatic. Your future was not something they were entitled to enter simply because their feelings had become strong. And strangely, this did not weaken their desire. It deepened it. Because suddenly the prayer was not only, God, let this person be mine. It became, God, if this path is right, teach me how to love them well. That difference matters more than they expected. Don't skip this part, because there was one particular thought that almost brought tears to their eyes. They imagined receiving everything they had been asking for, your trust, your closeness, your hand in theirs, the opportunity to call you their life partner, and then they imagined taking any of it for granted. The idea disturbed them. Not because something terrible was going to happen, but because they suddenly understood how rare it is to be truly known by another person and still welcomed. They thought about how many people meet each other but never really see each other. How many conversations remain on the surface? How many relationships become performances where both people slowly forget how to be honest? And then they thought of you. With you, they could imagine being seen without pretending to have every answer. They could imagine admitting uncertainty, they could imagine growing instead of performing perfection. That was the reason their request became so emotional. They did not want to marry you because they expected you to rescue them from life. They wanted to marry you because, for the first time, they could imagine facing life beside someone instead of escaping it through someone. Read that quietly in your heart. There is a tenderness in that distinction. And there is another layer they have barely admitted even to themselves. You awakened a picture of family in them that was not about appearances. It was about atmosphere. They started wondering what kind of home the two of you might create. Would it be a place where mistakes could be discussed without humiliation? Would laughter return quickly after difficult days? Would both people feel safe enough to say, "I need you," without embarrassment? Would kindness remain present even when nobody was watching? These questions began mattering more to them than grand romantic scenes. The future they imagined with you was not loud. It was warm. And perhaps that is why the realization arrived with such force. They had spent so much of their life assuming that the person they would marry would be the one who made their heart race the fastest. Yet when they thought seriously about you, they noticed something almost opposite. You made their heart feel settled. Not dull. Settled. As though some part of them that had been wandering between expectations finally understood what it had actually been searching for. Stay till the end, because they still had one question they needed to answer before they could understand the full meaning of their own prayer. They asked themselves, why this person? Why them? At first, many answers appeared. Your personality. Your strength. The way you carry yourself. The memories. The connection. But none of those answers felt complete. There was something underneath all of them. Something they could sense but could not immediately name. Then one memory surfaced. It was a moment when you were simply being yourself, without knowing you were making any impression at all. Maybe you spoke about something you cared about. Maybe you laughed without holding yourself back. Maybe you offered compassion when there was nothing to gain from it. And they suddenly remembered exactly what they had felt while watching you. I hope life protects that part of them. That thought shook them because it revealed something they had never consciously recognized. Their love was no longer centered only on what you gave them. They had begun caring deeply about what life gave you. They wanted good things to find you even when those good things had nothing to do with them. They wanted your dreams to survive. They wanted your confidence to expand. They wanted your peace to remain intact. And when they understood that, they realized their desire for marriage was coming from somewhere far more meaningful than simple longing. They did not only want you near them. They wanted to stand near the life you were becoming and help protect the space in which it could unfold. That was the moment their reason became clear. But there is still one part they have not fully understood. Because after asking God for the chance to marry you, another thought entered their mind, one so simple that they almost ignored it. Yet the longer they sat with it, the more they realized it might be the most important part of everything. They began thinking about the first thing they would want to tell you if they were ever given one completely honest conversation, no defenses, no confusion, no fear of saying too much. And strangely, the first words that came to them were not, "I love you." They were something else entirely, something that explains why they believe a future with you would change not only the way they love, but the person they become while loving you. And that is where the real reason begins. The words that came to them were almost too simple to explain everything they had been feeling. I want you to feel safe being fully yourself with me. And once that thought appeared, this person could not push it away. They had expected their deepest confession to sound more romantic, more dramatic, more like something people say when emotions are overflowing. Instead, what surfaced was quieter and somehow far more powerful. They wanted to become the person beside whom you would never have to shrink, perform, hide your uncertainty, or constantly prove your worth. They wanted to know the version of you that exists when nobody is expecting anything. The tired version. The hopeful version. The playful version. The thoughtful version that sometimes becomes quiet because there are feelings you need time to understand. And this realization changed the meaning of their prayer again. They were no longer simply asking God for a future with you. They were asking for the maturity required to create a future where both of you could breathe inside the relationship instead of feeling trapped by expectations. Don't skip, because this is where something they had misunderstood about you finally became clear. There were moments when your independence had confused them. Sometimes you seemed capable of carrying things alone, and they wondered whether there would even be a meaningful place for them in your life. They may have interpreted your strength as distance, your silence as uncertainty, your patience as a sign that you did not care as deeply as they did. But slowly, they began seeing those same qualities differently. Your strength was not an invitation for someone to leave you alone with everything. It was evidence that you had learned how to stand even when nobody was standing beside you. And instead of making them feel unnecessary, that realization made them ask a completely different question. What if love is not about being needed for survival? What if the greatest privilege is being chosen by someone who already knows how to stand? That question stayed with them longer than they expected. They began understanding that a healthy future with you could never be built on dependency or possession. It would have to be built on two people repeatedly choosing each other, not because either one was incomplete, but because life became more meaningful when their separate strengths were allowed to walk in the same direction. There was something beautiful about that thought. Something mature. Something almost unfamiliar to this person. Because somewhere in their past, they had learned to associate love with uncertainty. They had mistaken emotional confusion for passion. They had believed that constantly wondering where they stood somehow made a connection more valuable. But then there was you. Even during moments of uncertainty between you, something about the way they thought of you felt different. Beneath the unanswered questions was a strange sense of respect. Beneath the longing was admiration. Beneath the desire to be close was an even deeper desire not to damage something precious by rushing it. And that was when they realized why their prayer had become a prayer for marriage rather than simply another chance to be near you. They did not want a temporary moment. They wanted enough time to know you through seasons. They wanted to know who you became when life was generous and who you became when plans changed. They wanted to discover which songs you returned to years later, which traditions you would create without realizing they had become traditions, which ordinary Sunday would unexpectedly become one of the memories they treasured most. Stay till the end, because there was one scene they imagined that revealed more about their heart than any fantasy of a wedding ever could. They pictured the two of you years into the future after an ordinary day. Nothing spectacular had happened. There had been responsibilities, conversations, perhaps a few small frustrations, perhaps laughter over something ridiculous. And at the end of that day, they imagined looking across the room and realizing you were still the person they wanted to tell everything to. That image affected them deeply. Because suddenly they understood that marriage, at least the marriage they hoped to build, was not about maintaining one perfect emotion forever. It was about continually returning to one another through changing emotions. It was about learning how to say, "Come here, tell me what happened," even after years had passed. It was about remaining curious about you instead of assuming they already knew every part of you. That word curious became important to them. They did not want to marry you and then stop discovering you. They wanted to keep noticing. To notice when your dreams changed. To notice when something that once made you happy no longer fit. To notice when you needed encouragement without forcing you to explain every detail first. To notice your victories that other people might overlook. And the more they thought this way, the more humbled they became by their own request. Because asking for a lifetime with another person is enormous when you really understand what it means. It means asking to witness their becoming. It means promising not to treat growth as betrayal simply because someone changes from who they once were. It means understanding that the person you marry on one day will continue evolving through every year afterward. And strangely, this did not make them afraid. It made them more certain about the kind of love they wanted to offer. Something important is waiting for you here, because they finally recognized one quality in you that had quietly influenced all these thoughts. You had made them want to listen better. Not merely to your words, but to what existed beneath them. They remembered conversations where you had said something casually and only later did they understand how much meaning had been hidden inside it. They remembered small changes in your tone. Moments when you redirected a conversation instead of exposing something vulnerable. Times when you laughed something away because explaining it would have required more trust than you were ready to give. And looking back, this person wished they had understood sooner. Not because they believed they could read your mind, but because they realized how often people hear one another without truly listening. They began wondering how many moments between you had carried more meaning than either of you recognized at the time. That thought made them revisit memories differently. A pause was no longer just a pause. A kind sentence was no longer something to dismiss. A moment of patience suddenly looked like evidence of character. And then there was one memory they could not stop returning to. It involved a time when you could have made something entirely about yourself but you didn't. You considered someone else. Perhaps them. Perhaps another person. The detail itself was ordinary, but what it revealed about you was not. You had shown that your kindness was not something you turned on when you wanted affection. It existed naturally in the way you moved through situations. And this person realized something that left them unexpectedly emotional. If they ever built a family with you, that was the quality they would want filling the home. Not perfection. Kindness. They imagined disagreements where kindness survived. Decisions where respect survived. Difficult conversations where neither person used the other's vulnerabilities as weapons. They imagined children, relatives, friends, or simply the people who might enter your shared life feeling warmth around the two of you because love was not something performed for outsiders. It was built into the atmosphere. That was when their prayer became less about a ceremony and more about a home. And this is where the reason behind their request begins to become truly personal. For a long time, this person had carried a private fear that one day they might achieve many things they once wanted and still feel as though something meaningful was missing. They did not necessarily talk about this. It appeared during quiet moments. After good news. After busy days. Sometimes after being surrounded by people and still feeling strangely disconnected. They had begun wondering what makes a life genuinely rich when nobody is applauding it. Then they thought of you. Not as someone who would magically fill every empty place, but as someone with whom the ordinary pieces of life could become worth remembering. Suddenly success looked different. Success was not simply having more. It was having someone beside them who understood why certain things mattered. Someone who could celebrate progress but also remind them to slow down. Someone whose presence could transform a simple meal, a late conversation, a drive somewhere ordinary, into something they might remember years later. That understanding softened them. They stopped thinking of marriage as the final reward after everything else in life was arranged perfectly. They began seeing it as a partnership through the unfinished parts. Two people learning while they build. Two people admitting, I do not know exactly what comes next, but I want to understand it with you. And when they imagined saying that to you, they felt something they had rarely associated with commitment before: freedom. Not freedom from responsibility. Freedom from pretending. Freedom to admit that neither of you would always know what to do. Freedom to learn together. Freedom to change course when necessary. Freedom to apologize without believing an apology made someone weak. This person started realizing that perhaps the strongest relationship was not one where two people never disappointed each other. It was one where disappointment did not erase respect. Where mistakes became conversations instead of permanent definitions. Where both people remained willing to return to the same table and understand what happened. Don't skip this moment, because this realization is what finally answered a question that had been quietly troubling them. Why did the thought of marrying you feel so different from every romantic idea they had entertained before? The answer was not that you were flawless. In fact, the more honestly they thought about you, the more they understood that neither of you needed to be flawless for the connection to matter. The difference was that they could imagine reality with you. Real life. Not an edited version. You could have different moods. Different opinions. Different ways of processing things. There would be days when one person needed space and another needed reassurance. There could be misunderstandings that required patience. Plans would change. Expectations would evolve. And instead of destroying the image they had of a future with you, acknowledging these things made the image feel more believable. More human. More beautiful. Because they were no longer falling in love with an imagined story where nothing ever went wrong. They were falling in love with the possibility of building something strong enough to remain gentle when life was imperfect. There was one sentence they whispered to themselves after understanding this: I don't want a perfect life with them. I want a real life that we keep choosing together. And perhaps those words would leave you speechless if you could hear them directly, because they reveal something about this person that even they did not fully understand until recently. Their desire to marry you is connected to something much deeper than romance. You represent a kind of belonging they never knew how to describe. Not belonging as ownership. Belonging as recognition. The feeling of being in a conversation and suddenly realizing you do not have to translate every part of yourself. The feeling of being understood in ways that are difficult to explain. And even when you do not completely understand one another, there is still a desire to try. That willingness to try became precious to them. They began noticing how rare it was to meet someone who made them want to communicate instead of simply withdraw. Someone who made them reconsider their own assumptions. Someone whose perspective could challenge them without making them feel diminished. They started thinking about all the ways love could mature beyond the beginning. Attraction might introduce two people. Curiosity might bring them closer. Trust might open the door. But what makes two people continue choosing each other after the excitement becomes familiar? This person believes the answer may be something they already see in you, the ability to make depth feel peaceful. There are people who enter our lives and create noise. There are others whose presence somehow makes us hear ourselves more clearly. They began realizing you were the second kind. When they thought of you honestly, certain questions about who they wanted to become became louder. Were they living with integrity? Were they giving enough attention to what truly mattered? Were they carrying old habits into places where those habits no longer belonged? Were they ready to receive genuine love without questioning it simply because it felt calmer than what they had experienced before? These were not always comfortable questions, but they were meaningful ones. And that is what stunned them most. Loving you was not only changing what they wanted from another person. It was changing what they expected from themselves. Stay till the end, because this leads directly to the part of the prayer that they almost could not finish. They began by asking for the chance to marry you. Then they asked for patience, wisdom, courage, honesty. But eventually they reached one request that required them to surrender their own ego. They said, in their own quiet way, if loving this person means I need to grow, help me not resist that growth. And suddenly, memories came rushing back, not dramatically, but clearly. Moments where pride had made communication harder than necessary. Times when they waited for someone else to move first. Times when they hid tenderness behind silence because being emotionally honest felt risky. They saw how easily those habits could damage something meaningful if they carried them into a future with you. They understood that wanting your hand was not enough. They needed to learn how to hold it without controlling it. Wanting your heart was not enough. They needed to become trustworthy with what you chose to share. Wanting forever was not enough. They needed to respect the ordinary days that forever is actually made of. And something inside them shifted. Perhaps this is what their prayer had truly been leading toward all along. Maybe they thought they were asking God to change their circumstances, when in reality the deepest change was happening inside them. They were beginning to see love not as something that happens to a person, but something a person participates in creating every day. Through tone. Through patience. Through honesty. Through remembering that the person beside you has an entire inner world that deserves respect. And you, without even knowing it, had become the person who made them want to practice that kind of love. But there is another reason they have not yet fully admitted. A reason connected to something they once overheard, remembered, or understood about you when you believed nobody was paying attention. It was not a declaration of love. It was not something meant to impress them. In fact, you may not even remember the moment. Yet when this person finally connected it with everything else they had noticed about you, they realized why the idea of standing beside you for life had stopped feeling like a distant wish and started feeling like a deeply personal prayer. Because that small moment revealed what you would protect if everything else disappeared. And what they discovered about your heart in that moment is the reason their next words to God became even more specific.